She tasted one bite of the roast I had spent 7 hours preparing, set her fork down with the careful deliberation of someone who had rehearsed the gesture, looked around the table to make sure every eye was on her, and said, "I've had better." The room went so quiet I could hear the candles flickering, and I did something no one at that table expected. I folded my napkin, placed it beside my plate, stood up without a word, walked to the front closet, put on my coat, picked up my purse, and walked out the door. I drove home alone in the November dark, made myself a cup of chamomile tea, and sat by the window while my phone filled up with messages I did not read until morning. I want to tell you something I wish someone had told me 40 years ago. Love, real love, the kind worth keeping, does not ask you to vanish so that someone else can take up more room. Generosity is a gift. It is not a contract that can be rewritten by the person receiving it. And there is a version of dignity so quiet, so composed, that it terrifies the people who were counting on you to collapse instead. That is the version I finally found at 64 years old, in a house that is entirely mine, after a lifetime of setting myself on the back burner for people who never once turned down the heat. My name is Margaret Elaine Holloway. I am 64 years old, widowed 3 years ago when my husband Leonard passed from a heart condition we had known about for most of our married life, but never quite believed it would actually take him. I live alone in the house we bought together in 1988, in a small town in central Ohio, where the winters are long, and the neighbors still wave when you pull into the driveway. And on a Sunday in November, the Sunday of the family gathering I had been planning for 6 weeks, everything I had been quietly accepting for 3 years finally reached its limit, and I stopped accepting it. If any part of what I am about to share sounds familiar to you, if you have ever cooked all day for people who couldn't find a single kind word, or given generously to someone who only saw it as evidence they could ask for more, I want you to stay with me until the very end of this story, because I think you will recognize something in it. And if this is your first time here, I would be so grateful if you considered subscribing, because this is a space for women like us, women who have earned their peace and are learning, sometimes the hard way, how to keep it. The life I have now is one I built slowly and deliberately, the way you rebuild anything after a long period of loss. When Leonard died, I was 61 years old, newly retired from 26 years as an elementary school librarian, and suddenly, frighteningly alone in a house that had always been full of noise. The grief was real. I won't minimize it. But grief, when you let it do its work honestly, also has a way of clarifying things. You stop postponing. You stop accepting the provisional version of your own life. You start asking what you actually want, rather than what is easiest for everyone around you. Within the first year after Leonard passed, I redecorated the bedroom in colors I'd always loved and he had always tolerated. I started attending a Tuesday morning watercolor class at the community center. I planted a kitchen garden along the south wall of the backyard, and I learned, for the first time in my adult life, how to cook entirely for my own pleasure. Slow recipes, complicated sauces, dishes that took all afternoon and filled the house with a warmth that asked nothing of anyone. I joined a small book club that met on the second Thursday of every month, and I read things that had nothing to do with anyone else's needs. By the time November of that third year arrived, I had found something I can only describe as a reliable inner quiet. Not happiness exactly, want something steadier than happiness. A sense of being genuinely settled in my own life, my own space, my own company. That particular Sunday began the way the best November mornings do in Ohio. Gray and cold outside the window, the yard still holding the last of the autumn leaves along the fence line, the kitchen warming quickly once I turned on the oven. I'd been up since 6. The roast had gone in at 7. By 8, I was working on the stuffed mushrooms. By 9, the cranberry relish was cooling in a bowl on the counter. And by 10, I had the table set with the good china. Leonard's mother's china. The set with the narrow gold rim that I had washed by hand every year since 1989. I stood at the kitchen window with my second cup of coffee, watching a pair of cardinals on the fence. And I remember thinking, this is a good morning. This is a very good morning. And then my phone rang, and it was my son, Daniel, calling to say they were leaving 40 minutes later than planned because Renata had needed to change her outfit. That single sentence, offered without apology, without acknowledgement, that I was standing in a kitchen that had been running for 4 hours, told me everything I needed to know about how the day was going to unfold. But I said, "That's fine, Daniel. Drive safely. And I went back to basting the roast. Renata, my daughter-in-law. I need you to understand something about her before I go any further because this story does not make sense without a clear picture of who she is and what our relationship had actually been beneath the polite surface we maintained at family dinners. Renata Holloway, née Caruso, had married my son Daniel 8 years ago in a ceremony I helped finance, in a venue I helped select, wearing a dress I had spent 3 weekends helping her find. She was 31 at the time, sharp, attractive, professionally successful in the marketing field, and possessed of a particular kind of confidence that sits very close to the border of entitlement without ever quite admitting it. She was never outright rude to me in those early years. She was something more sophisticated than rude. She was dismissive in the way that people are when they have decided, privately and irrevocably, that you don't quite count. Daniel is my only child. He is good-natured in the way that people sometimes are when they have never been required to be brave. He loves Renata. He defers to Renata. And he has always chosen the path of least resistance between us, which meant that for 8 years, the path of least resistance ran directly over me. The dynamic between Renata and me had never been warm, but it had been, for the longest time, manageable. She was pleasant enough at Christmas. She remembered my birthday most years. She thanked me when I cooked, in the way that you thank a restaurant for a satisfactory meal. Acknowledgement without gratitude, recognition without warmth. And I had accepted this because Daniel seemed happy, and because I had been raised to believe that keeping the peace was worth almost any personal cost. Looking back now, I can see the architecture of that arrangement very clearly. But at the time, I was inside it. And things that you are inside are always harder to see. The pattern began, as these patterns almost always do, with something that felt like generosity. 6 months after their wedding, Daniel and Renata were between apartments. A lease had ended. The new place wasn't ready for 3 weeks. And of course, I said, "Come stay with me. It's just 3 weeks." Of course. That is what mothers do. 3 weeks became 5. 5 became 8. By the time they moved into their new apartment, Renata had reorganized my kitchen cupboards without asking, decided my guest bathroom needed a better energy, and replaced my towels with ones she preferred, and established a habit of inviting her own friends over for weekend brunches in my home, as though the house were a shared resource she had a standing claim on. I said nothing. I was so glad to have Daniel close. I was still in the early, raw stage of learning to live with Leonard's decline, and company felt like a kindness, even when it cost me. That was the seed. I can see it now with perfect clarity. After they moved out, the expectation of access to my house, and to me, never fully receded. It simply changed form. Could I host Thanksgiving? Of course. Could Daniel drop off some things to store in my basement, just temporarily? Of course. The boxes are still there. Could I watch their dog for 2 weeks when they went to Costa Rica? Of course. I didn't particularly want to watch their dog, but of course. There were 2 episodes in particular that I return to now, not with bitterness, but with the particular clarity of someone who has finally understood a lesson they were slow to learn. The first was Christmas of the year before last. Renata had decided, without consulting me, to move the holiday gathering from my house to theirs. Partly, she said, because my house was a bit cramped for the number of people she was planning to invite. I had never found my house cramped. Leonard and I had raised a child in it, hosted 30 people for 4th of July, kept an open door for decades. But I said, of course, whatever works best. And I contributed 4 homemade pies and a spiral ham to a party in someone else's house where Renata introduced me to her colleagues as Daniel's mother without once using my name. The second episode was last spring. I'd planned a small garden party, 8 people, the book club, a Saturday afternoon. I had mentioned it to Daniel in passing. The Saturday of the party, Renata called at 10 in the morning to tell me that she and Daniel would be stopping by with her parents, who were visiting from out of state. Not asking, telling. They arrived at noon, stayed until 4, and consumed most of the food I had prepared for my own guests. Renata's mother spoke only Italian and sat in my best garden chair the entire afternoon. I served everyone graciously and then sat with my book club friends in the kitchen because the patio was full. I said nothing. I kept the peace. What changed in the most practical and structural sense was that the last of Leonard's estate was fully settled 16 months ago, a process that had taken longer than expected due to some complexities with a small piece of property he had owned with his brother. Once that was resolved, I was for the first time in my adult life entirely free of financial entanglement with anyone. The house was fully mine, paid for in my name alone. My pension and Social Security gave me a modest but entirely sufficient income. My savings were healthy. I owed nothing to no one. And this freedom, quiet, undramatic, arrived at slowly, had changed something in me that I could not quite name at first, but that I now recognize as the simple, radical act of no longer needing anything from anyone badly enough to swallow my own dignity to keep it. That is the change that makes everything else possible. Not anger, not resentment, though both of those visited me at various points. Just the clean structural fact of not needing to. So when Renata sat down at my table that November Sunday, picked up her fork, cut a small piece of the roast I had been preparing since dawn, placed it in her mouth, let a silence expand across the entire table, and then looked up with that particular half-smile she kept in reserve for moments like this and said, "I've had better." I want you to understand that those 3 words did not land on someone who was still willing to absorb them. They arrived at exactly the wrong moment in my life to go unanswered. But my answer was not words. My answer was my coat and my empty chair. Let me tell you the full scene because the details matter. There were 9 people at the table. Daniel and Renata, my sister Patricia and her husband Jean, my neighbor Fran, who I had invited because she had recently lost her husband, and I didn't want her to be alone on a gray Sunday in November. Renata's colleague Michelle and Michelle's husband, whose name I never caught because Renata had invited them without mentioning it to me until Thursday evening, when I was already 2 days into cooking, and 2 of Daniel and Renata's friends from their running group, a couple named Brett and Cassie, who had the aggressively wholesome energy of people who treat every meal as a nutritional transaction. I had cooked for 9 people, technically 7 since I had planned for 7 and scrambled to extend the menu when I learned about Michelle and her husband. The roast was a crown rib I had ordered specially from the butcher on Elm Street, which I had marinated for 36 hours in a blend of herbs from my own garden. The stuffed mushrooms, a sweet potato gratin, fresh cranberry relish with orange zest, a green bean dish with toasted almonds and a shallot dressing, homemade dinner rolls that I had started at 5 in the morning, and for dessert, a bourbon pecan pie and a layered apple cake with brown butter frosting that I had baked the day before so the flavors could settle properly. I want you to have that image clearly. 9 people, 7 hours of cooking, a table set with china that had been in this family for 35 years. Renata arrived with a bottle of wine she hadn't brought for me, but had apparently brought to look generous in front of the other guests. She was wearing something she had clearly chosen with the self-consciousness of someone who wanted to be noticed, which was fine. That's her way. She greeted Fran with the particular brand of warmth she reserved for people she had decided were not competition. She ignored my kitchen entirely. We sat down. I brought out the roast. I carved it at the table because Leonard always had, and it felt right to maintain that particular ritual. People served themselves. Conversation started, and then Renata lifted her fork. The moment she tasted the meat, I was watching Daniel tell Jean something about a work project. I didn't see her face immediately, but I heard the silence that followed, because silence at a full table has a texture, and I turned toward it the way you turn toward anything that suddenly goes still. She had set her fork down. She was looking around the table with that measured, practiced expression that she used when she wanted an audience. She waited just long enough for the table to quiet on its own, for that natural break in multiple conversations that happens every few minutes at a dinner party, the brief communal pause. And into that pause, she dropped her 3 words with the deliberateness of someone placing a stone. I've had better. Daniel looked at his plate. Patricia looked at me. Fran, bless her, looked confused as though she couldn't quite believe she had heard correctly. Brett and Cassie exchanged the look of people who sensed something but weren't sure what. Michelle said nothing. Her husband reached for the bread. I looked at Renata. She was not looking at me. She was looking slightly past me, at a point in the middle distance that suggested she was already moving on, that the comment had been delivered and filed and she was ready for the next thing. She reached for her wine. And here is the moment, and the exact moment that I want you to understand as clearly as possible, because it is the whole story compressed into a single internal event. I did not feel angry. I felt something much quieter and much more permanent than anger. I felt the last wire snap, not the wire of love for my son. That one held, that one always holds, but the wire of willingness. The wire that had been held taut for 8 years by the belief that if I cooked well enough, hosted generously enough, said yes often enough, the people I loved would eventually see me. That wire, in the moment Renata looked past me toward her wine glass, finally gave way. Quietly, without drama. The way a wire does when the tension that was holding it has simply been sustained too long. I picked up my napkin. I folded it once, neatly, along the original crease. I placed it on the table beside my plate. I pushed back my chair and stood up. And because I'm a woman who was raised to be composed, my face was entirely calm. I looked once at Patricia. I believe she understood immediately. I walked to the front closet. I put on my coat. I picked up my purse from the bench by the door, and I walked out. I did not slam the door. I closed it behind me the way I always close it, firmly until the latch catches. I drove home in the dark. I made chamomile tea. I sat by the window, and I let the phone fill up with messages I did not read until 8 o'clock the next morning, because it was my Sunday evening, and I was not going to spend it managing someone else's discomfort. What I heard from Patricia the next day, she was the first person I spoke to, because Patricia has never in her life softened a truth to spare your feelings, and I needed truth that morning, was this. After I left, the table had remained absolutely silent for nearly a full minute. Then Renata had said, "Well, she's always been a little sensitive." And Daniel had said nothing. And Fran, my neighbor Fran, who had lost her husband 6 months before and had come to my table because I had not wanted her to be alone, had looked at Renata and said, quietly and without raising her voice, "That was an unkind thing to say about someone who spent a week preparing this for you." And then Fran had picked up her fork and continued eating. And the dinner had proceeded in the particular, strained, overcompensating way that dinners do when something true has been said and no one knows what to do with it. Renata had not apologized. Not that night. Not by text. Not in the 6 days that followed. Now, I want to pause here for a moment and say something directly, because I think it is important, and because I know that some of you are in situations where similar things are happening to you. What Renata did at that table was not simply rude. What she did was something that psychologists who study family systems refer to as a status display. A deliberate act designed to establish dominance within a social group by diminishing another person in front of witnesses. It was not impulsive. The deliberateness of it, the waiting for the right moment, the casting of the glance around the table before speaking, the choice to look past me rather than at me after delivering the line, all of that is calculated. People who do this have usually been doing it for a long time in small, deniable ways, and when those small ways have been consistently tolerated, they eventually feel entitled to a more public version. The reason it works, the reason it had been working on me for 8 years, is that the person on the receiving end is almost always more invested in preserving the relationship than the person delivering the blow. You absorb the impact because you believe the relationship is worth protecting. You accept the diminishment because you love the person adjacent to the one diminishing you. And every time you absorb it without consequence, the behavior is rewarded. Not consciously, perhaps, but rewarded nonetheless. The message that is received every single time you fold your napkin and stay seated and smile is, "This is permitted. This is within the range of what is allowed here." I had been sending that message for 8 years, and it had been received exactly as sent. There is also something I want to say to anyone listening who owns their own home, because I hear from so many women who are uncertain about this. Your home is not a community resource. It is not a family asset held in trust for anyone other than you. You are not legally, morally, or relationally obligated to make it available to anyone. Not your children, not their spouses, not their friends, not anyone. Simply because they expect you to. You have the absolute right to determine who enters your home, when, under what conditions, and for how long. You have the right to withdraw that access. You have the right to place conditions on it. You have the right to revoke an open invitation that has been abused. None of that makes you cruel. None of that makes you a bad mother or a selfish person or a difficult woman. It makes you a homeowner who has read correctly the terms of the arrangement she has been living under and decided to renegotiate them. I am telling you this not as legal advice. Please consult an attorney if you have specific concerns. But as a matter of basic principle that I wish someone had stated plainly to me a long time ago, your property belongs to you. Your space belongs to you. Your kitchen, your time, your Sunday afternoon, your good china with the gold rim. All of it, yours. In the days that followed that dinner, I made several decisions. None of them were dramatic. None of them were announced. I simply began to act in accordance with what was actually true, rather than what I had been pretending was true for the sake of an easier surface. The first thing I addressed was the food situation because it was the most immediate and the most symbolic. Daniel and Renata had a habit, one that had established itself so gradually I had almost stopped noticing it, of arriving at my house for weekend visits and treating my kitchen as an extension of their own. They would open the refrigerator without asking and take whatever they wanted. Renata, in particular, had a habit of finishing whatever I'd made for my own meals during the week and then commenting, as though it were a curiosity, that the refrigerator was getting low. On 2 occasions, she had used ingredients I had bought specifically for recipes I was planning and had simply repurposed them for her own cooking, without mentioning it until after the fact. I had said nothing about any of this. I had restocked. I had kept the peace. The week after the dinner, I bought a small refrigerator, a compact countertop model, the kind people put in home offices, and I put it in my bedroom. I moved into it everything I was saving for specific purposes. The good cheese I bought at the farmer's market on Saturday mornings, the homemade preserves, the marinating components for recipes I was planning, the specific condiments that were mine. I left in the main refrigerator what had always been communal, the basics, the things that were genuinely shared, and I secured the rest. I also quietly moved my good pantry items, the imported olive oil, the specialty flours, the better vinegars, the chocolate I used for baking, to a different storage location, one that was not in the main kitchen. I didn't make an announcement. I simply reorganized. And the reorganization meant that what was available in the common areas of my home was functional and adequate and not mine in any particular way. The Saturday after the dinner, Daniel and Renata arrived for what had become, at some point in the preceding year, a standing weekly visit. Renata went directly to the kitchen as she always did. I heard the refrigerator door open. I heard it close. I heard it open again. Then she appeared in the doorway of the sitting room where I was reading. "The fridge is almost empty," she said. "The fridge has everything that needs to be there new," I said, and turned the page. She looked at me for a moment in the way that people do when they have been spoken to in a register they don't recognize. Not hostile, but different, unfamiliar. She went back to the kitchen. I heard her and Daniel speak quietly for a moment, and then they made themselves sandwiches from what was available and ate them at my kitchen table without comment, and the visit proceeded in a way that was noticeably shorter than usual. I had also, in the days between the dinner and that Saturday, done something practical about the guest room. For the past 2 years, Renata had kept a collection of items in my guest room. Clothes she rotated between her house and mine, beauty products in the attached bathroom, what amounted to a second wardrobe staged in a room she had no claim to. It had begun, I suspect, as convenience during one of their longer visits, and had simply never been reversed. The room was technically a guest room, but in practice it had become an extension of Renata's personal storage, which meant it was no longer available as a guest room without advance coordination with her schedule. I cleared it, entirely and systematically. I placed everything that was Renata's in 3 neatly packed bags labeled with her name and stacked them in the front hallway. I also had the lock on the guest room door replaced, a project I had been meaning to do anyway, as the original lock had been sticky for years. I had the locksmith come on a Thursday morning. The new lock was keyed to my master key, which I kept. When Daniel and Renata arrived the following Saturday and Renata went upstairs to the guest room, she went without asking, the way you open a door to a room you believe belongs to you. She found it locked. She found the bags in the hallway. She found me in the sitting room reading. My things are in bags in the hallway, she said. Yes, I said. Why is the guest room locked? Because it's a guest room, I said, and I've reclaimed it for its intended use. She looked at me with the expression of someone who has just discovered that the floor they were standing on is not as solid as they believed. It was not quite shock. It was more like recalibration. Are you expecting guests? She asked. At some point, yes, I said. Fran has been talking about staying over when her daughter comes to visit and needs her spare bedroom. There was a pause. Daniel, who had come up behind Renata on the stairs and had clearly heard the exchange, said, Mom, I think Renata just... The bags are clearly labeled, I said. Everything is there. I went through it carefully. I turned back to my book, and after a moment that felt much longer than it probably was, I heard them carry the bags to the car. The reaction that week came not in person, but by phone. A series of texts from Daniel that escalated over the course of 3 days, from confused to concerned to, finally, quietly frustrated. He did not call. He texted, which told me everything I needed to know about how much courage he was bringing to the situation. I responded to each text with care and with honesty, but briefly. I reorganized the kitchen because it's my kitchen. The guest room is mine to use as I see fit. I'm not angry. I'm just no longer making myself small to avoid discomfort. He did not respond to that last one for 2 days. When he did call, finally on a Wednesday evening, his voice had the particular tone of a man who has been coached. I could hear Renata's fingerprints on the phrasing. He began with, I just think we should talk about what's happening, and proceeded to suggest that I might be, and I want to quote this as accurately as I can, going through something since Dad died that was making me a little more reactive than usual. I let him finish. He is my son, and he deserved that courtesy. Then I said, Daniel, I'm not reactive. I'm not going through something. I'm 64 years old, and I'm making choices about how my home is used and how my time is spent, and these are entirely ordinary choices that I should have been making for years. What you're describing as reactive is what it looks like when someone you're used to walking on decides to stand up. Silence on the line. I cooked for 9 people for 7 hours, I said. Your wife sat down, tasted the food, and told the table she'd had better, and then she waited for me to fold. I didn't. She was just... He started. I know, I said. She was just being Renata. And I spent 8 years accepting that as an inevitability. I'm not doing that anymore. So what does that mean? He asked. And his voice, when he asked it, was the voice of my son. Not Renata's echo, not the coached version, just Daniel, who is 41 and still sometimes sounds like the boy who used to ask me things he was afraid to know the answer to. It means that this house is the only thing in my life that is entirely mine, I said. Leonard and I built it together, and when he died, it became mine alone, and I intend to treat it accordingly. The door's open to you whenever you want to come through it as a guest, a real guest, which means you ring the bell and you don't open the refrigerator without asking, and you don't store things in rooms that don't belong to you. The door's open to Renata on the same terms. But the version of this house that was available to be used as a convenience, that version is closed. He said he needed to think. I said that was fine, and that I loved him, and I meant both things entirely. 2 weeks after the dinner, I was reviewing my monthly bank statement, a habit I had maintained carefully since Leonard's death, because managing the finances alone had required me to become more attentive to them than I had ever needed to be when we were managing together. I noticed a charge I did not recognize. It was from a home goods retailer for a sum just under $400 on a supplementary credit card that I had added Daniel to 5 years ago for genuine emergencies. I had added him to it after a specific incident. He had been traveling for work and had his wallet stolen, and I had wanted him to have a backup resource. The card had been used perhaps 4 times in 5 years for entirely legitimate purposes, and I had largely stopped thinking of it as something that required monitoring. The charge was for decorative items. I looked it up. The retailer's purchase history, which I could access online, showed a transaction consisting of throw pillows, a set of decorative trays, and something described as an artisan wall feature. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I pulled up the card's full statement for the previous 6 months, and looked at it carefully for the first time in years. There were 3 other charges I did not recognize: a restaurant dinner for what the amount suggested was a large group, a spa service, a charge from a boutique I had never heard of. None of them catastrophic individually. The total across 6 months was just under $900. But all of them were charges I had not authorized, for purposes that had nothing to do with emergencies, made without a single mention to me. I did not call Daniel that evening. I sat with what I was looking at for the better part of an hour, drinking tea, watching the dark outside the window, and what I felt was not primarily about the money. $900, while not nothing, was not a sum that was going to disrupt my life. What I felt was about the assumption behind the charges, the quiet, unstated belief that the card was available, that my resources were available, that I was a resource. Something to be drawn on when convenient, without consultation, without acknowledgement. I called the credit card company the next morning and reported the supplementary card as compromised. I did not lie. I explained that charges had been made that I had not authorized, which was factually accurate. The card was canceled, and a new one was issued to me alone. The account was returned to my name as the sole authorized user. It was done in 15 minutes, with the same procedural calm that I had learned to bring to every financial task since Leonard died. The calm of someone who has learned that clarity is always kinder than postponement. I did not tell Daniel immediately. I sent him a brief email. I chose email deliberately because email creates a record, informing him that I had closed the supplementary card, that the account was no longer accessible to anyone other than myself, and that if there were outstanding charges he had been planning to make, he would need to use his own resources. I kept the email to 4 sentences. I did not reference the specific charges. I did not use the word unauthorized. I did not give him the opportunity to explain or rationalize in real time. I simply stated what had happened and what the new arrangement was. His response came 3 hours later. It was 2 sentences. Got it. Is everything okay? I wrote back, everything is fine. Thank you for asking. There was also the matter of the car. This requires a bit of context. Leonard's car, a reliable, well-maintained sedan that had become mine after his death, had been made available to Daniel and Renata on 2 specific occasions when their own car was being repaired. Both were genuine emergencies. Both were short-term. Both were returned with the tank filled and a verbal thank you. These had been legitimate uses of a resource I was glad to share. What had happened since, however, was that Renata had begun treating the car as available on a casual, ongoing basis. She had borrowed it 4 times in the preceding year. I know because she had asked Daniel to call me, never asking directly herself, for reasons that ranged from my car is getting detailed to we have more people than will fit in one car and it would just be easier. Each time, the car had been returned a day or 2 later than promised, once with a new scratch along the rear panel that no one mentioned and that I discovered myself when I went out to the garage. I had said nothing. I had let it go. I had kept the peace. I had the car keys back now from the most recent borrowing. I took my spare set, the set I had left accessible on the hook by the kitchen door, which was where they had always been, in exactly the position of something that has been made available, and I moved them to a different location. Specifically, I added them to the ring with my bedroom keys, which I kept on my person. The hook by the kitchen door was left empty. The next time Daniel called and mentioned, with the casual air of someone asking about something that had never been a problem before, whether the car might be available the following weekend because Renata's was going in for service, I said, "No, I'm sorry, it won't be available. I have plans." I did not explain the plans. I did not have any specific plans. But I had plans now in the way that I had not had plans before. I had the plan of being a person who did not automatically make herself available. He paused. "Oh," he said. "Okay, we'll figure something out." "I'm sure you will," I said. "You have a rental car option through your insurance, don't you?" "I think so," he said. "Good. That would work perfectly." That was the entire conversation. It was about 3 weeks after the dinner when my brother-in-law's wife, Leonard's sister Patricia, not my sister Patricia, which I realize is confusing, called and asked if she could come by that weekend. Her name is Carol. She and Leonard's brother Raymond have been married for 40 years, and they are people I care about and have always maintained a cordial, if not particularly close, relationship with. Carol calling to arrange a visit was not unusual. What was unusual was the weight in her voice and the particular phrasing of her request, which was that she needed to talk to me about a few things while Raymond was away at his cousin's place. The timing, I noted, specifically waiting until Raymond was away. She arrived on a Saturday afternoon with a coffee cake she had baked herself, which was a thoughtful gesture and which I appreciated. We sat at the kitchen table. She asked about my garden. I asked about her grandchildren. And then, after perhaps 15 minutes of the careful pleasantries that precede a difficult conversation, she set down her coffee cup and said she wanted to be honest with me because she felt I deserved honesty. I told her I appreciated that. She began by expressing concern for me, my isolation, she called it, though I do not experience my quiet life as isolation. She said Daniel had spoken to Raymond about some tension in the family, and that Raymond had been worried, and that they both just wanted to make sure I was all right, and that whatever was happening between me and Renata was, she understood, difficult. But family was family, and they hoped I could find a way to... Carol, I said, gently but very clearly, I appreciate you coming, but I want to make sure I understand what it is you're actually here to discuss. She hesitated, then she said it. Not quite directly, but close enough. Raymond, she explained, had been having some financial difficulties. Not serious, she was quick to say. Nothing to be alarmed about. But they had some unexpected expenses, a roof repair, and some medical bills from Raymond's knee procedure last fall, and they had been trying to manage things on their own, but it had been a strain. And given that Leonard's estate was fully settled now, she wondered. And Raymond didn't even know she was asking. She wanted me to understand that this was entirely her idea. Whether I might be in a position to offer some help. A loan, she said quickly. Not a gift. A loan. They would pay it back. She named a figure. I looked at her for a moment. I looked at the coffee cake she had brought, which was genuinely good, and at her hands around her coffee cup, and at the careful way she had structured this conversation. The concern for me first, the family is family framing, the mention of Raymond's not knowing, which was almost certainly not true. Carol, I said, I'm glad you felt you could talk to me, and I'm sorry Raymond is having a hard time. That sounds genuinely stressful. She began to say something. I continued, but I'm not going to be able to help with this. My savings are for my retirement. They're not a family fund. I spent 30 years building them alongside a man who is no longer here, and they are what stand between me and the kind of financial precarity that becomes very serious for a woman my age who is living alone. I can't loan them out, even to people I care about, because loans to family members don't come back the same way they went out, and I am not in a position to absorb a loss. Carol was quiet. I would also say, I continued, because I thought it needed to be said, that the conversation I imagined Daniel had with Raymond about what he called tension was probably not the most accurate version of events. I haven't created tension. I've simply stopped absorbing it. She looked at her coffee cup. She said she understood. She said she hadn't meant to make me uncomfortable. I told her she hadn't, and I meant it. The conversation had not made me uncomfortable. It had made me very clear. We finished our coffee on civil terms. She left the rest of the coffee cake. I thanked her for coming, and I meant that too. She called Raymond from the driveway, I'm fairly certain. Because 3 days later, I got an email from Raymond himself, which was something he had done approximately twice in the years I'd known him, expressing hope that we were still family, and that whatever was happening could be resolved. I wrote back that I hoped so too, and that I had a warm regard for both him and Carol, and that my position on the financial matter was unchanged. He did not write again. My bedroom. I want to tell you about my bedroom. I'm going to be very specific about this because I think the specificity matters. My bedroom is the one room in my house that had always been entirely mine, even during the years of Leonard's illness when the house had sometimes felt less like a home and more like an extended care facility. It is the room where I keep the things that are only mine. The books I'm reading, the watercolors I'm learning to do slowly and imperfectly, the photographs of Leonard and of my parents and of Daniel as a child, the small wooden box where I keep my jewelry. It is the room I had redecorated after Leonard died, in the colors I had chosen for myself, A soft, warm gray that changes quality with the light, curtains the color of old linen. No one had a reason to be in this room, and no one had been, to my knowledge. Until I found, on a Monday morning, approximately a month after the dinner, that someone had been. The context is this. Daniel and Renata had been staying over for a weekend, something that I had allowed to continue while I was still in the process of deciding how to restructure things, and which I had managed by being more deliberate about what I communicated and what I made available. They had slept in the guest room, which I had unlocked for the weekend. On Monday morning after they left, I went to put a book back on my shelf, and I noticed that things were out of order. Specifically, that the small wooden box where I keep my jewelry was not quite in its usual position, and that the drawer of my bedside table which contains nothing particularly sensitive, reading glasses and a bookmark and some correspondence, was not quite closed. I stood in the center of my bedroom for a long time and felt something very cold and very precise pass through me. Not quite anger, precision, the kind of clarity that only arrives when a thing that you had hoped was not true is confirmed. I did not confront Renata directly about what I believed had happened. I had no proof that could survive a conversation. What I had was the evidence of my own eyes and the pattern of the preceding 8 years. I did something practical instead. I had a keyed lock installed on my bedroom door. A proper one, not a privacy lock. I moved the small refrigerator to the corner of the room near the window. I moved my watercolor supplies to the closet shelf, and I placed a small, inconspicuous camera, the kind that can be monitored from a phone, on the bookshelf facing the door, angled to cover the room's entry. This is entirely legal in one's own home. I want to be clear about that. And I want to be equally clear that I found no further evidence of intrusion, because within 2 weeks of installing it, the situation had changed in ways that made the question moot. The last weekend, Daniel and Renata stayed at my house. In the second month after the dinner, ended in a confrontation that I did not initiate and did not escalate, but that I also did not step back from. It began with a closet. There is a large storage closet at the end of the upstairs hallway, the one that had always been used for holiday decorations, extra linens, the stored remnants of a family's accumulated life. At some point in the past year, Renata had begun using a portion of it for overflow storage from her own home. Again, the pattern was familiar, a temporary accommodation that had simply never been reversed. I had noticed, but not addressed it. There were boxes of her things on the lower 2 shelves, labeled in her handwriting, which I found in retrospect particularly revealing since labeling implies permanence. That Saturday morning, while Daniel was still asleep and I was reorganizing the closet, a task I had decided to undertake that day with or without an audience, Renata appeared in the hallway. She was in her robe, holding her coffee, and she stopped in the hallway door and watched me for a moment. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Reorganizing," I said. I'd already moved her boxes to the hallway. I was clearing the lower shelves for my own boxes of Christmas decorations, which had been displaced to the basement when her things arrived. "Those are mine," she said. "I know," I said. "They're in the hallway. I'll help you carry them down to your car." She set her coffee cup down on the hallway table. My hallway table, which she had been using as a surface for the past year without comment. And she said, "Margaret." Just my name with a particular weight behind it, the kind of weight that is designed to function as a warning. "Renata," I said, in the same tone, and went back to reorganizing the shelf. What followed was not, in the end, a shouting match. Though the volume increased considerably from her side, she said that I had no right to touch her things. I said that her things were in my storage space, and I was adjusting the arrangement. She said I was being deliberately hurtful. I said I was reorganizing a closet. She said that Daniel had always told her she was welcome here. I said Daniel was welcome here, and that she was welcome here as a guest, and that guests did not use the host's storage space as a personal annex without asking. She said, and I want to be accurate, "I cannot believe you are doing this to us." And I said, very calmly, the thing that had been true for the longest time. "Renata, I am not doing anything to you. I am simply doing things for myself. The fact that those two feel like the same thing to you is something worth thinking about." She looked at me. Then she turned and went back to the guest room and closed the door. Daniel appeared at the top of the stairs 10 minutes later, in the particular way that people appear when they have been listening to something from behind a door. He looked at the boxes in the hallway. He looked at me on the ladder, reorganizing the top shelf. He said, "Mom." "Good morning," I said. He said, "What's happening?" I said, "I'm reorganizing my closet. Can you help me carry those boxes down?" He carried them down. He and Renata left before lunch. And the crack in something between them, visible, unmistakable, the hairline fracture that had been widening since the dinner, was wider that morning than it had been the Saturday before. I could see it in the way they moved around each other in the kitchen as they packed their things, in the silence that stood between them in the hallway, in the way Renata did not look at Daniel when she picked up her coat, and the way Daniel watched her not look at him and said nothing. I had not put that fracture there. I want to be clear about that. I had not created the fault line between them, but I had, over the past 2 months, stopped being the surface that absorbed the pressure in their relationship. And without that absorption, the pressure had nowhere to go but between them, where it had always actually lived. Over the following 2 weeks, the messages and calls from Daniel became shorter and less frequent. Not hostile. Never hostile from Daniel, who is constitutionally incapable of sustained hostility. Just quieter. Something was shifting at his end, in ways I could only partially see. And then, on a Saturday afternoon when I had not been expecting anyone, I heard a car in the driveway and looked out the window and saw Renata's car. Only Renata's car. She knocked. I went to the door. She was standing on my front porch in the November cold. It was the second month now, almost exactly since the dinner, without her coat, which suggested an impulse decision or a determination to seem less armored than usual. She was not smiling. She looked honestly tired. I opened the door. "Can I come in?" she asked. I considered it. "You can," I said. "Come in." She sat at the kitchen table. I made tea without asking if she wanted it. She watched me make it, and then she began. And what she said was this. She was sorry for what had happened at the dinner. She had thought about it. She had thought about a lot of things, and she recognized that it had been unkind, and that it wasn't the only unkind thing she had done, and that she understood if I was angry. I poured the tea. I sat down, and I said, "I'm not angry, Renata. I was never primarily angry. I was tired, and I was clear." She looked at her tea. "Daniel and I have been," she started. "We've been having some conversations about things." "I see," I said. "He said some things I hadn't expected him to say," she said. And there was something real in her face when she said it. Not performed, not strategic, genuinely real. The face of someone who had received information that changed something. I believed her. I want to be clear about that. I believed that the apology was genuine and that some real shift had occurred, and that Renata was sitting at my kitchen table with actual regret rather than tactical regret. I have enough experience with the difference to know it. "I accept your apology," I said. "I mean that. Whatever happened between you and Daniel, I'm glad you came." She started to say something about things being different. "I need you to understand something," I said. "Accepting your apology doesn't change the arrangements I've made. The guest room is mine. My kitchen is mine. The storage spaces are mine. Those things are not going back to the way they were because the way they were wasn't workable. Not for me. Can you understand the difference between those two things?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded. "Good," I said, "because I want us to have a real relationship, a respectful one that works for both of us. I'm genuinely open to that, but it can't be built on the old terms." She asked what the new terms were, and I told her she was welcome in my home as a guest, which meant advance notice, which meant asking rather than assuming, which meant understanding that the things in my house were mine and not available without my agreement. Nothing punitive, nothing petty, just the basic terms of being a guest in someone else's home. She said she could do that. I told her I hoped she was right. After she left, I did something I had been planning and had been deliberately waiting for the right moment to do. I sat down and wrote Daniel a letter. An actual letter, handwritten, on the stationery I keep in the desk in the study. I told him that I loved him, which is always true. I told him that I was proud of him for finding the courage to say things he hadn't said before, because his finding that courage was, I suspected, part of what had brought Renata to my door. And I told him that he was welcome in my home whenever he chose to come, on the new terms, which I outlined simply and without elaboration. And then I told him, as clearly and as kindly as I could, that the current arrangement of indefinite access and undefined presence needed to resolve itself by the spring. That by April, I needed my home to function as my home alone, which meant that any belongings still in my basement needed to be retrieved, and any informal arrangements that had accumulated over the years needed to be formally concluded. Not because I didn't love him, because I did. And because I was 64 years old and I had earned the right to live in my own house on my own terms, and because that right was not going to be indefinitely postponed out of habit. I sealed the letter. I mailed it. And then I walked out to the garden, even though it was November and cold and there was very little growing. And I stood for a moment with my hands in the pockets of my coat and looked at the bare beds and the fence and the two cardinals who had come back, or who might have been different cardinals. I could never quite tell. And I breathed the cold air and felt the particular quality of a house that is, without question, entirely mine. The Sunday morning that truly restored something in me, the morning I point to when I try to identify when things genuinely settled, was a morning perhaps 3 weeks later. The house was quiet. It had been quiet, in the right way, for most of those 3 weeks. Daniel had called twice, both times briefly and warmly, and both conversations had had a quality I can only describe as honest. Less managed than before, less mediated by performance. Renata had texted once, a simple message asking how I was, which I had answered with equal simplicity. I woke up at 7. I made coffee from the good bag I keep in the personal refrigerator. I put on Leonard's old flannel robe, the one I'd kept because it still smelled faintly like him on cold mornings when the house held the cold, though I know that's mostly imagination now. I sat in the armchair by the window with my coffee and my book, and I listened to the house. The house was quiet the way a house is quiet when it is fully occupied by the person who owns it. Not the silence of absence, the silence of sufficiency. Fran came over that afternoon. She had taken to coming on Sunday afternoons, and I had taken to being genuinely glad to see her. She brought her needlepoint. I made soup. We sat in the sitting room with the lamps on against the gray December light and talked about Leonard and about her husband Gerald and about the strange, necessary business of learning to occupy your own life after sharing it for so long. She stayed for 2 hours. When she left, I washed the soup bowls and set them back on the shelf and stood for a moment in the kitchen with the lights on and the dark outside and felt something that I have been trying ever since to name accurately. The closest I can come is this. I felt like the version of myself that had always been here, finally unobstructed. 2 months after the dinner, Daniel came alone on a Saturday, the first time he had come without Renata since before their wedding, essentially. He brought a plant from the nursery, a small lemon tree in a ceramic pot, because he remembered that I had mentioned wanting one for the kitchen windowsill. He rang the doorbell. He asked if it was a good time. He handed me the lemon tree. And I stood in the doorway of my own house with my son on the porch, and I felt the particular fullness of something that has been genuinely repaired rather than merely papered over. He stayed for 3 hours. We had lunch. We talked about his work and about his therapy. Yes, therapy. He mentioned it as casually as you mentioned the weather, which I found quietly encouraging. We talked about Leonard, which we had not done together in longer than I could precisely recall. And before he left, he carried the boxes up from the basement, his boxes, the ones that had been there for 2 years, and loaded them into his car without being reminded, without drama, quietly, the way a person handles a responsibility they have finally accepted. At the door, he said, I should have handled things differently for a long time. I said, You're handling them differently now. He nodded. He kissed my cheek. He drove away, and I closed the door behind him, firmly until the latch caught, and stood in my front hall for a moment with my hand still on the doorknob. And then I went to the kitchen and put the lemon tree on the windowsill where the light was best. What I learned about myself in the months between that November dinner and the December morning, I sat by my window with my coffee in the quiet house, What I understand now that I did not understand clearly before is this. I had confused availability with love for so long that I had lost track of where one ended and the other began. I gave constantly, effortlessly, reflexively, because giving felt like caring, and I am a person who cares. I had not understood that there is a version of giving that is not love at all. It is appeasement, and appeasement is not a virtue. It is a slow surrender of yourself, offered one compromise at a time, so gradual you don't notice the accumulation until you look up one day and realize that the person sitting in your kitchen has taken the last of the good olive oil and not mentioned it, and that you have been deciding for years not to notice. The moment I walked out of that dinner, put on my coat, and closed the door quietly behind me, that was the first honest thing I had done in 8 years of that relationship. Not cruel, not dramatic, honest. I simply stopped pretending that what was happening was acceptable, and I let the room figure out what to do with the truth of it. And the truth, as it always does eventually, did its own work without my assistance. Your peace is not a guest room. It cannot be borrowed without asking, reorganized without consulting you, left messier than it was found. It belongs to you entirely. And the best thing you can do with it, for yourself, and in the end, for the people who love you, is to keep it that way. If any part of what I've shared today lives in a corner of your own experience, if you have ever found yourself standing in a kitchen that was supposed to be yours, serving a meal that no one thanked you for, to people who had already decided you didn't quite count, I want you to know that you are not alone in that, and that there is a version of yourself on the other side of the decision to stop accepting it that is worth every uncomfortable week it takes to get there. I tell these stories because I believe in the kind of community that forms around shared truth. Women who are done being small, women who are learning, at whatever age they find themselves, that dignity is not a luxury and peace is not a selfish indulgence. If this story reached something in you, I would be so grateful if you would consider subscribing. Not as a transaction, but as a way of saying, yes, I know this feeling, and I want more of this conversation in my life. Leave me a comment and tell me, have you ever walked out of a room where you had been made small? Have you ever stood at the door with your coat in your hand and felt, underneath everything else, the terrifying and unmistakable sensation of finally being honest? I read everything, every word, because your stories are the reason I keep sharing mine.